The thaw had come the way it always came in the Vermont hill country in March. Not warmth exactly, but a loosening. Days that climbed just above freezing and nights that dropped back well below it. And Silas Prentice had learned as a boy that this particular back and forth was the one thing the maples had been waiting for all winter. He was up before the light, the way sugaring season always demanded, and out to the barn to hitch the horse to the gathering sled while his breath stood white in the dark. The trees wanted tapping, while the cold still held the morning, and by the time the sun came properly over the ridge, he already had the auger in his hand and was walking the near row of the sugar bush, boring each trunk at a careful upward angle, driving the spile home with 3 clean taps of the mallet, and hanging the bucket beneath it to catch whatever the day's thaw would coax out of the wood. "Started without me," his son Warren said, coming up through the trees at a trot, 12 years old and considerably more awake than a boy his age had any right to be at this hour in March. Somebody had to. You can catch the next 20 trees if your arm's equal to it. Warren's arm proved equal to it mostly, though by the 40th tree his taps had gone from confident to merely determined, and Silas let him rest the auger and carry the mallet instead, which struck them both as a fair division of labor for a boy his size. The sugar house itself stood at the low point of the bush, a plain plank building with a wide roof vent to let the steam escape, built by Silas's own father 30 years before and added onto twice since. The arch and evaporator pan replaced only 4 years past, with the newer flat pan style that a man from the county fair had convinced Silas was worth the expense. It had proven worth it. The old kettle method his father swore by had taken twice the wood and half the day again to do the same work, and Silas had never once regretted the change, though he was careful not to say so too loudly around his father's old friends, who still held opinions on the matter. By mid-morning, the whole sugar bush was hung with buckets, near 200 of them across the hillside, each one catching its own thin, irregular music. A drop, a pause, another drop, the sound of an entire hillside letting go of its winter one small measure at a time. Sap ran clear and cold and barely sweeter than well water straight from the tree, which never failed to disappoint anyone tasting it fresh for the first time, expecting syrup and getting something closer to a faint promise of syrup, 40 gallons of which would need boiling down to make 1 gallon of the real thing. Silas's wife Delia had the sugar house fire already going when he brought the first sled load down. The small, low building filled with steam and the sweet, faintly smoky smell that meant the season had properly begun, and she looked up from feeding the firebox with the particular satisfaction of a woman greeting a season she'd been waiting on since January. "Good run this morning?" "Good enough. Cold held nicely overnight." He tipped the gathering tank into the storage vat, feeding the evaporator, sap sloshing pale and clear in the gray March light, and the great flat evaporator pan began at once to take up the work of turning gallons of thin sap into something worth the whole hillside's trouble. The boiling was the part of the season that asked the most patience and gave back the least to show for it, hour after hour of steam rolling up through the roof vent, the fire wanting careful tending, hot enough to keep a rolling boil, never so hot as to scorch a pan of sap that had already given up 3/4 of its volume to the air. Delia managed the fire through the length of the morning with an ease built up over 11 sugaring seasons, feeding in split maple from the woodpile stacked head-high along the sugar house wall, checking the depth of the boil with a practiced eye that needed no thermometer to tell her when the sap had thickened past syrup and toward the edge of sugar, and when it had not thickened nearly enough yet at all. Neighbors drifted through across the day the way they always did in sugaring season, because a sugar house with steam rising from its roof was an invitation nobody in that country ever felt they needed formally extended. Old Mr. Kessler came by at noon with a jar he wanted filled from last year's stock, and stayed a good half-hour longer than the errand required, warming himself by the arch and trading opinions on how this year's run compared to the last 5 he could personally recall. The Whitcomb girls came through after their own morning's gathering, faces bright with cold, and Delia gave them each a taste of the day's syrup straight from the finishing pan, testing hot on a clean scoop of last week's snow, the way every sugar-maker's child in that country learned to love the season before they learned much of anything else about it. "Nearly there," Delia said, watching the pan's color deepen from pale gold toward amber, the boil growing thicker and slower with every passing hour. An hour more, maybe less. Delia tested the pan the old way, the way her own mother had taught her and her mother before that, dipping a scoop into the near-finished syrup and holding it up sideways in the cold air, watching how the liquid ran off the edge. Thin syrup dripped in separate drops. Syrup close to ready ran together into a thin sheet before it fell. She watched the edge of the scoop with the particular patient attention of a woman who had learned years before that guessing wrong in either direction cost you either a thin syrup nobody would want to buy or a batch scorched past saving in the time it took to be distracted. "Sheets," she said mostly to herself, satisfied, and drew the pan back from the hottest part of the fire to slow the boil for its last careful minutes. Warren spent the afternoon running the near buckets while his father worked the further trees, the gathering sled making its slow circuit of the whole sugar bush twice more before the light began to lean west, and by 4 the day's sap was mostly in, the last of it steaming its way down toward syrup in the evaporator pan, while Silas and Warren stacked another day's worth of wood against the sugar house wall for tomorrow's fire. The syrup came off the pan a little after 5, drawn through a felt filter into the big holding can. The sugar house filled floor to rafters with a sweetness so thick it seemed to have its own weight, and Delia held the finished can up to the last of the daylight coming through the door and pronounced it, as she pronounced it most days this time of year, good enough to be proud of, and not one drop better than the day before deserved. They banked the fire, latched the sugar house door, and walked back up to the house together as the light went out of the hills entirely, the whole hillside behind them gone quiet again, but for the small steady drip of 200 buckets, still catching whatever the evening's cold might yet coax loose before morning. Supper was simple, the way it always was in the thick of the season, when nobody had energy left over for anything elaborate, ham and beans and good bread, and for pudding, because it was sugaring season and no other excuse was strictly required. A spoonful of the day's fresh syrup poured warm over a bowl of last week's snow, which Warren ate with the particular reverence of a boy who understood he had roughly 6 weeks a year to enjoy it, and intended to make the most of every single one of them. "Can I check the buckets in the morning before school?" Warren asked, half asleep already, the question coming out slower than it had started. "You can check the near row. School wants you by 8, and the buckets will still be there whether you check them or not. I'd rather check them. I know you would. Silas said it with no small amount of fondness, because he had asked his own father some version of that same question most mornings at Warren's age, and had gotten, as best he could recall, more or less the same answer. Afterward, the family sat a while by their own kitchen stove, Delia mending by lamplight, and Silas going over tomorrow's row in his head the way he went over it every evening this time of year, and Warren fell asleep sitting up in his chair before the lamp had burned an hour, worn through from a full day of tapping and gathering, and simply being 12 years old in the best season of his year. Silas carried him up to bed without waking him, the way he'd carried him up more nights this March than any other month, and came back down to bank the stove and take one last look out at the dark hillside, where 200 buckets hung patient in the cold, filling slow and steady, exactly as they would go on filling every night this whole sweet, brief season through. He went up himself not long after, the house settled and quiet around him, his own body carrying the day in the plain, honest way it always did this time of year, the pull across his shoulders from the auger, the particular deep tiredness that came only from a day spent entirely between cold air and hot steam. He thought, without any urgency, of tomorrow's row, and of whether the cold would hold again overnight the way the trees wanted it to, and then he thought of nothing at all, and the house and the hillside and the whole quiet sugar bush settled into the dark together, and Silas Prentice slept.